Good day, good people. My name is Brad King, and this is the Downtown Writers Jam video podcast, which is part of the Solid Listen podcast network. We're coming to you from deep inside the jam bunker today. Fall is here. I'm in my sweater. It's wonderful weather. Very sad Max isn't here. This was his favorite time of year. It is also my favorite time of year. So a little bit about the show today. Sometimes I do shit on the show because I want to. I try very hard to make this show diverse and interesting and bring people from all over the place and all walks of life and all publishing backgrounds and all the stuff. Like, it's really important to me that the show look like the world. I mean, every once in a while, somebody comes across my desk and I'm like, oh yeah, shit, I'm bringing this person on because I would like to talk to him. And today is one of those days. Robbie Bach is here, and his book, The Wilkes Insurrection, is out now. It's his first novel. And you know, I love talking to people when they've written their first novels. It's always fun at that point. Here's why I wanted him on the show. And I've done this before. Paul Vidic was on the show a little while ago. And Paul was, I think, at Warner Music when I was at Wired. And I wrote one thing about him. He was one of the only people in that level of C-suite stuff that rarely talked to the press. All the other people always wanted to talk. And the only time I wrote about him was that it was a press release with his stuff in it, right? It's one of those bullshit things you drop in. Robbie led the team that created Xbox. Now, if you know me, I don't really play games. I never really play. I play Dungeons and Dragons, obviously. Played in television growing up. For those of you that don't know what that is, look that shit up. It was the cool version of Atari. But like, I never really got into computer games and stuff like that. But my writing partner, John, and I wrote a whole book about Dungeons and Dragons and computer games. And when I was at Wired, part of the reason that came about was because Microsoft was getting ready to launch this thing called the Xbox. And it was Microsoft's attempt to get into the living room, right? So Apple was going about it through consumer devices, and Microsoft decided to go about it through this Xbox. And eventually it would do things like stream, you know, Hulu and movies and all that kind of stuff. Now the DVD player, and you could play music through it, all of that stuff. It was, if I'm remembering correctly, it was not allowed. There were restrictions on it being sold around the world because you could daisy chain them together and turn them into a supercomputer, right? And so the Xbox was like this revolutionary gaming system, but it was really the Trojan horse. And I wrote a lot about this as Microsoft's attempt to sort of get past what they fucked up with the whatever the iPod, you know, with the music stuff that they were building that everybody was digging. And so Robbie ran that team. Well, I mean, shit, that's 22 years ago, right? Like that's right when I was at Wired covering this stuff. And so I'm always fascinated when people from that world end up in this other world, right? Like when Janelle Brown goes from, you know, being a technology journalist to being a famous fiction writer, like that shit, that's interests me. I mean, outside of being my friend, like that's some cool shit. Robbie doing the Xbox thing and then being like, hey man, I think I want to write books. What is interesting, and I'm not going to go through his whole, like I wrote his whole resume bio down here. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but he served on the board for the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. He's done a stuff, I believe, with the Boys and Girls Club, Brooks Running. He was on the board for Brooks Running, the Space Needle. Like he's just done a whole bunch of stuff, right? Like, and he's really into civic engagement and things of that nature. Yeah, he serves on the National Board of Governors for the Boys and Girls Club of America. So like he's actively involved in civic and social things after he left Microsoft to do this. Here's the other reason outside of just my own personal, like, shit, blast from the past. Like we're going to do this thing again, right? So if you've heard these interviews, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about this stuff. What's really interesting to me is that if you've heard the show, whenever I have screenwriters on or people that come from a screenwriting background, there is that they tend to be very good novel writers. because they have a structure, because they think in visual language, they understand what a scene is, and they have this like, oh, this needs to happen here. This like that's the nature of screenwriting. Whereas novel writing is like, until you know, like there's a format, but it's sort of different all the time. But if you're doing a thriller or a procedural, there's a way, and so you're used to thinking that way. Well, Robbie was around people that were making games on computers. And this is where like my book comes in, right? Like the narrative became this huge part of games. Richard Garriott started doing it with the Ultima series. And it went into, there was this branch between computer games where they had these sandbox games, and then these other games that would be narratively driven. And a lot, like as people were putting these games together, some of them would have writers, some of them would, they bring screenwriters in, they would bring all these different kinds of people in the early days of this stuff, trying to figure out how much gameplay exists and how much story exists. And so these forms developed around that. And even if you're a ludologist, somebody that believes that story and game doesn't matter, there are still scenes, and those scenes are crafted, and there's a set amount of time and things must happen in them in a certain place. So I was really fascinated with Robbie, who did the Xbox, and he was not he wasn't a creative. He came from marketing. So he had that storytelling thing to it, but then he gravitated to and was around all these people that were thinking about story and game. And so it's not that weird of a leap for me that he becomes a writer. Maybe this is only a thing that I see. I mean, I'm not like, it's not like, oh, nobody else would understand. It's not a big fucking leap, but this is like literally what I wrote about. And we got our book deal in large part because of the writing we did about this stuff. Me over at Wired, I was originally approached, and then I brought John onto the project because he's a way better writer than I am. And then we sort of branched out and got into this idea of like storytelling, games, computers, and the internet, and sort of how they all impacted each other. So for me, Robbie does not know this, although if he listens to this, he'll hear now, like a big part of my writing career, like moving from magazine into book writing into where I am now, stems from the writing and work that I did around like the innovative storytelling stuff that was happening in games. So I'm super excited, right? Like this is totally like a moment where I get to interview somebody that I really want to interview because of the profound impact that they had on my life, instead of just like loving writers and like wanting their stuff to do well. So today's a little bit selfish for me. But I also hope that you like it, because you'll hear he's fucking great, man. Like you got two super extroverts coming at you. So if you are introverted at all, like take a deep breath, maybe drink some sleepy time tea, because we will keep you up. Before we get to that interview, couple bits of business. I need you to do a couple things to help us out. So the Jam, our 60-minute show, comes out every Wednesday. These video podcasts come out every Monday and Friday. Two things you can do. First, tell your friends about us. Always people that are interested in stories and reading and stuff like that, tell them about us. That's all you got to do. This shit's free. It doesn't cost you nothing. Help us out. The second thing you can do is leave us a review. If you are on Apple Podcasts, leave us a written review, leave us a starred review. That's super helpful. If you're not, head over to the Writers Jam Facebook page and leave us a review there. You can also head on over to thewritersjam.com, and there you get the video podcast series, you get book reviews. If you want to buy books, you can click on the bookshop link and support local and independent bookstores across the country. You can sign up for our newsletter, and you can support everybody on the Solid Listen Podcast Network for just a couple bucks a month. Molly and Nicole are growing this thing. I think we got 12 or 13, 14 shows, like all around pop culture. Got a couple more in line with what I do, a little bit less about pop culture. There's an MLM podcast, which is really fascinating. So for just a couple bucks a month, commercial-free episodes, behind the scenes stuff, all kind of stuff, you support everything Molly's trying to build here, and it would be great. So I appreciate you stopping by the bunker to spend a little time with us today, and to indulge me as I get to talk to somebody who influenced my career. I hope your day is going well. Hope you're treating each other well. Hope you're taking care of yourself. Take those mental breaks when you need to. Remember, Vacation time is money, so take your vacation because you've earned it. Now, I hope you will sit back and enjoy my conversation with Robbie Bach.
It's the 20th anniversary of Xbox this year, too.
Yeah.
And when people always say, so what was it like? I was like, well, think of it this way. Broadband didn't exist yet.
Right. Buffering was the way the world was.
Yeah, look, we were debating whether the Xbox should have a 56K modem in it. I mean, just think about that. Thank God that was too expensive, so we took it out. But just imagine.
Yeah, it's, having covered all of that stuff at Wired, like I rolled in I was one of the first people to write about the MP3 stuff and all the lawsuits and all the ways and that spilled out. And
right.
Outside of the law, a lot of what I wrote about was this sort of intersection of society, technology, and business. And a lot of that played out through the entertainment space. The way
right.
in which we use these things today was really defined by, we weren't kids, but we were young.
Yeah.
And this stuff was really just like, you look back in history and you can tell a story, but at the time it was like, fuck, I don't know.
Right. Totally right. Totally right. So for this morning, what would you like to do?
So this is what we're doing. This is the show. Like we just
right.
kind of talk about this stuff. So
perfect.
One of when I interviewed Paul, because he was the vice president of new media at Warner Music. And so when you came across my desk, it was another one of these like, oh, we're back in the day. Like I'm always interested in the transformation because of how you go from executive this to novelist this, because those two things are very disparate from each other.
Sure.
So was writing something that you always wanted to do?
Well, I've always loved to write. So I entered my first writing contest in high school. That tells you how far back this goes. But of course, you get in the business world and what you're writing is memos. So I wrote some world-class memos. When I left Microsoft, I didn't leave to write. I left to go do civic work.
Yeah.
And so I got involved in a bunch of nonprofit organizations, the big one being Boys and Girls Clubs, and loved that work. And in the process of that, I said, hey, we did a bunch of strategy things on Xbox. I need to write about that. And so I wrote about an 11-page thing about that. And I said, well, 11 pages is the perfectly long length. It either needs to be 3 pages or it needs to be 200 pages. And
I chose for 200 pages.
And I chose the 200-page option. And so I wrote a book, Xbox Revisited, which I published in 2015. And, I use that in my consulting work. I use it in my public speaking work. It's great. And it's a nice book. It's sort of part memoir of Xbox, but mostly focused on strategy. And when I got done with that, I just said, wow, I really love to write. And I said, well, I could do another nonfiction book. And then I said, but boy, that would be really boring. It's not interesting.
Yeah.
And so I want to challenge myself to learn new things. So I said, okay, let's write fiction. And I started writing fiction by writing, probably 100 pages on 4 or 5 characters that have been kind of running around in my head. No plot, no storyline, not even really an idea that this was going to be a thriller. Just let me write about the characters. And then I started to see ways, and they're contemporary characters, so they're taking place in today's time. I started seeing how they could come together, and I love thrillers. So I started thinking about that from a plot perspective, and pretty soon I had the idea for a book.
So there's 2 things that I want to talk about. Like, how do you end up at Xbox? And this is going to connect to where you are now. Like, was that because a lot of people, like I didn't want to be a technology journalist. I'd been a feature writer, but that was sort of the most interesting thing that was happening at the time. And so I gravitated to that.
Well, I worked in Office for 5.5 years, ran marketing for Office, decided I'd launched 3 versions of Office. That was enough. It was time to go do something else. So I went to work in this little backwater inside Microsoft called the consumer division. And I went to work for the guy who is my best friend and business partner today, a guy named Pete Higgins, who you may remember. And we had a bunch of sort of disparate consumer stuff that came to work for me. Part of which was the gaming business, which at that time was Flight Simulator and Age of Empires. It was this tiny little PC gaming business.
Yeah.
And then this idea of Xbox came along, and so people looked to me and the people in my team, Ed Freeze, who runs the gaming business.
Oh yeah, I knew Ed.
Yeah, and Rick Thompson, who ran our hardware business and did mice and keyboards and Actimates and things like that. And so suddenly, this ended up being Rick's job. And literally a month into the project, Rick decided to leave Microsoft, so it became my job. And that's how I became chief Xbox officer.
And is your background, you said you were running marketing, like, is that your background? Like, is that?
Yeah, my background is marketing and business. I'm an MBA from Stanford. I'm a business person,
Yeah.
which turns out to be valuable in the Xbox case because it's actually a really complicated and interesting business model.
Right.
And it was super helpful that I had a pretty long history at Microsoft, because managing the relationship between Team Xbox and Team Microsoft was a whole nother gear.
I got to write a lot about that.
Yeah, and those were my two sort of core areas: is running the business, helping the marketing and brand work get going, and managing the relationship between Microsoft and the business. But I don't have a technology background at all.
And I mean, the marketing, at least marketing has a story component to it, right? Like, at least like that. Well, so like there is that creative element of your background.
Yeah, the fact. And then the other thing that happened during this time is I spent a lot of time with game developers.
This is what I wanted to ask about.
Yeah. So I spent, I visited all of our publishers at least twice a year. You spend time with game development teams. People say, hey, I want to show you something. And what you discover when you're talking to a game developer is the first thing they're thinking about is story.
Yeah.
And they are telling a digital interactive story. And so, the combination of sort of, three pegs on the stool. One peg is I love to write. The second peg is this storytelling experience with Xbox. And the third peg is my desire to have an impact and explore new areas.
Yeah.
And so you put those three things together, and from that came the desire to write a novel.
It's the first thing that I thought. I've interviewed a ton of screenwriters who have become novelists, and all of them, and I also wrote a book about game developers and storytelling. And so when I saw that, I'm like, oh, I mean, if you're sitting atop of this thing, they think cinematically, they think in scenes, they think in like, so there is a structure that you have for storytelling that you would have picked up over those 20 years, whether you knew you were doing that or not.
Exactly. And
right.
And when you read the Wilkes Insurrection, the immediate reaction I get from a lot of people, I mean, there's a bunch of things that are pretty common. People love Major Tamika Smith. They love the story. But one of the things people say is, gosh, this would make a good video, 10-part series type thing, because it's written that way.
Yeah.
Right. And it's written in, the chapters, there's 66 chapters, but they're 4 pages long. Mm-hmm. And so each chapter is a scene.
Yeah.
And so that influence has happened, and I can't completely explain it.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely happened.
Yeah. It's the screenwriters that I've talked to have said, like, there's a constraint, right? There's 2 hours. You have 2 hours, and at minute 7, this needs to happen. And at minute 12, this needs to happen.
Right.
And so when they transferred into writing, they both had a visual language in their head, but also a structure. And it's the shit that people like me, writers, struggle with as they write novels, because we don't have a structure. You have to learn that. And so I just I was fascinated when I saw this. I'm like, oh, this actually makes sense that you write books, just what I know based on all the game folks.
Well, and what's interesting is I had 2 writing influences that kind of fought against each other. So one is this scene-driven creative work from Xbox, right? So you get that. And the second is, I really like to write, and most of my writing's been long essays, thesis, things like that. So the first draft of what became the Wilkes Insurrection was 175,000 words.
Oh my God.
And 550 pages.
With a lot of exposition? Well,
no, it's all backstory.
Oh.
And so what you discover is that the inclusiveness that comes with being somebody who's written the thesis document, and the challenge of somebody who wants to write these little scenes.
Yeah.
In the first version, it was all backstory. And so I had the first editor I worked with, she said, okay, that chapter is really well written, super interesting, but you have to write it in one sentence for the book. So you have 16 words, write that chapter in 16 words, and we're going to put it in right here.
Yeah.
And suddenly the book went from 175,000 words to ultimately 107.
Yeah. In media res becomes really important when you're editing. Like, oh yeah. Like nobody cares.
Nobody cares.
Yeah.
They don't care. And yet, if you're developing the character, you have to know the backstory.
100%.
Right.
I mean,
and so in a way, doing it the hard way was actually helpful for me.
yeah, I got bad news for you. Like all of us, it's a hard way for everybody. Like the joke in the show is that nobody knows how to write a novel, and the only way to learn is to write it. And the only thing you learn after you write it is that you can finish it, because the next one's going to be a little bit different than that one.
Right.
Like,
well, and I get the question from people a lot. So how do you write? And so I've talked to a bunch of authors. I mean, you obviously have.
Yeah.
And I talked to a bunch of authors, and none of them write the same way.
No, it's a shit show.
Everybody's different. You know, so I wrote characters first, plot second.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I have other people who I talk to who say, no, I know the end of the story. I've written the plot. I have an outline.
Yeah.
And then I fill it in. I couldn't write the story that way.
Yeah. One of my friends, actually, you may know her, Janelle Brown. She used to write at Salon, and she covered some of the during the same time. She's now a famous novelist.
Right.
We've been friends forever. And like, she always says, like, I get a character in my head and then I just start putting them through stuff, you know, like that's sort of like, that's, you know, and then you sort of figure out like, this is the story. Like,
and then you talk to people about the tools they use, and some of them use these custom writing tools where they can move scenes around easily and create blocks of text and la la la. Well, I was a Word product manager, so I use Microsoft Word. I've demoed the product like 1,000 times.
Yeah.
So that's my tool of choice.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I always tell people, like, this is the least literary podcast, because we don't talk about that stuff, because every writer will tell you like writing is terrible. And like the two things I've told folks is you're not a writer until you've edited your draft, and that you read a lot. You have to read a lot, because the answers to what you're trying to do are in other people's books, whether it's how they did it or the inspiration, or you just see something and go, holy crap, this is the way through. Right. Like that's what writing is. Like the first draft is, I don't want to say easy, but like it's easy compared to the fifth draft.
Well, and rereading your own work is just hard.
Yeah. I mean, it's why we're self-loathing people.
Yeah. Well, clearly I haven't written enough books yet, because I'm not quite there yet. But I suspect I'll get there eventually.
Get there. I tell people, being a writer is two things: is being narcissistic enough to think you have something to say that people should hear, and then self-loathing enough that everything you read, you put the good stuff aside and you just look at the bad stuff. Right. So you have this sort of dual thing of like, I have a thing to say, but I'm awful at it.
Yeah, it's being self-critical is hard, and you know, like that cut from 175,000 to 107, about 30,000 of those words is an entire branch of the story. So it's like, get out a saw and just and it's all gone. Yeah. And you know, the truth is the thriller's better because of it.
Yeah. And that'll be a short story or a novella that you put on Audible.
Well, yeah, and no, again, it ends up being, you know, part of the novel, but it's a few paragraphs.
Yeah.
And you know, there's all this detail that's really cool, by the way, but nobody will ever read it.
The best chapter in the book that John Borland and I published was not in the book. It just didn't fit the narrative. And like, so we'd go on shows to talk about it, and they're like, what's your favorite part of the book? And I'm like, well, here's the part that's not in the book. That's my favorite part of the book.
Yeah, exactly.
So
anyway, that's sort of the way Wilkes Insurrection came about.
Yeah. Are you like really fun. Are you like, so you're a big thriller reader?
Yes.
Like whole lifetime, like that's your gig.
Lifetime. Well, I should say caveat. Thriller and mystery
aren't
not the same genre, but related.
Yeah.
So like Dick Francis is a hero.
Yeah.
Right now, I don't know anything about horses. I can barely ride a horse. The dude wrote mysteries about horses, and he wrote a bunch of them, and they're all awesome. And I've read every one of them.
So you also had that there, right? Like, because I truly believe you cannot be a writer unless you read a lot, because again, you'll just sort of, I don't want to say naturally, but like over time you do something enough, you understand the structure. Like, oh, here's the turn. Like halfway through, I better have a big reveal. Right?
Well, you're right. And like in the case of the Wilkes Insurrection, I'm writing along, and the first thing anybody who reads books, a thriller, says, all right, you got to grab me in the first few paragraphs. Okay, I get that.
Sure.
And it's no secret that in the Wilkes Insurrection, there's a plane crash right at the beginning. So I'm thinking, oh, I'm golden. I've got this exciting sequence that happens right at the beginning. And, so that's not a secret. There's no suspense around that, but the crash is exciting in and of itself. But then as I was writing along, I said, that's not enough. There's no intrigue in the suspense. There's action, but there's no intrigue.
Yeah.
In the crash. So I stepped back and I said, okay, and this is where you borrow from other writers.
Yeah.
I said, well, I'm going to write a prologue. And the prologue is a scene that's going to take place way towards the end of the book.
Yes. I know this structure. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm going to write that. And I don't even know how I'm getting there yet. Right. I haven't figured out the plot. There's no outline that gets me there, but I think it's a cool scene. So I'm going to write to get there. And so I wrote the scene in the prologue from the perspective of my antagonist, my villain. Mm-hmm. And so you're in his head in the scene, which is this, prologue. That's actually something that takes place way in the future.
Yeah.
And you go through it then. And then when I get there in the book, I write the scene from the protagonist's point of view. Mm-hmm. And, same scene.
Sure.
But different.
Yeah.
And you now connect the front of the book and the back end. And that prologue is, I think it's some of my best writing. And it's really good. And you get to the end of that and you go, oh. and that's the goal. And then you start with an immediate action scene. And now you've got somebody.
Yeah, you got the car chase, right? Like you go to an action movie, there better be a car chase and explosions at the beginning. Somebody's chasing something.
Why does a James Bond movie always start with a scene from his last episode?
Yeah.
Right? He always has this action scene, which has nothing to do with the rest of the movie. Right. But it's an action scene that sort of grabs you and then you say, okay, I'm in a James Bond movie. Okay, ready to go.
Well, and it's interesting that you did that from both perspectives, right? Because another one of the topics we talk about all the time on the show, particularly for nonfiction folks, is that it's really easy for nonfiction folks to get, particularly if they're new, to think they're telling the story and not realizing that a series of events isn't a story. And depending on the lens that you're looking at those events through, that story is going to be told differently. Right.
Well, it's fun that you bring that up, because one of the other techniques I had to figure out in writing the Wilkes Insurrection is, okay, point of view.
Yeah.
Now, I wrote the full first draft without thinking word one about point of view. I just wrote.
Yeah.
And so my point of view in that first draft bounced around all over the place.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I had to do in the second draft was, okay, pick a point of view. And I decided not to do that. So I am in the head of different characters. Now, when I'm in their head for the chapter. And so where you are as a reader. But at some point in the book, I'm in every character's head.
Yeah.
Writing from their perspective.
Isn't it weird? Like when you sit down to write, particularly, I've been doing this for a while, but like,
sure,
point of view intents are things that like you don't think about when you're new into the business, and then you do it and the editor reads it and is like, past, present, where are we? Who are we in? Like, do they know everything? Like, what's going on?
When I wrote that first draft, I was an omniscient person in somebody's head, which of course is a contradiction in terms, right? That doesn't actually work.
Right.
And so I had to switch to being, okay, I'm in somebody's head. Whose head am I in? All right, I'm in that person's head. What can they know?
Right.
And how do I write this scene knowing what they can know?
Yeah.
And that intentionality was hard to learn.
And then
to switch it with each scene and say, oh, I'm in Tamika Smith's head now. oh, now I'm in Ford Wilkes's head, who's the villain, and now I have to write from a villain's perspective.
Right. And
that's fascinating. It was wonderful, but it's hard.
And I was when I went to Berkeley for graduate school for journalism, Michael Lewis was I was his teaching assistant. Sure. He did new thing and Blindside and like all that stuff, right? And one of the things he said that I've never forgotten is every story needs a Darth Vader, and Darth Vader never thinks he's Darth Vader, right? Like nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks they're the bad guy, right? Like that is not how people work. And even as a nonfiction writer, like I always tried to keep that in my head. But as I've interviewed novelists and fiction writers, we've talked a lot about empathy. As fiction is a way for people to get empathy because you embody other people's stories. Doesn't matter what book it is. But as a writer as well, like you have to tap into a deep wellspring of your emotional stuff to be like, okay, like this person does not think they're Darth Vader. Or if they do, there's a reason that they're Darth Vader. And like, how do I then present this in a way that isn't just transparently black hat and white hat?
Yeah, the hardest part for me was writing from my antagonist's point of view.
I mean, I hope so.
Right. Yeah, exactly. In part because that's not the way I am, but in part because you have to make them human.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
And enable people to understand their motivations for why they're the way they are. That's an art form, and it takes a long time to sort of figure it out.
Yeah. And but that's what I mean, particularly with like prestige TV and things like that. Like modern storytelling is far more complex, I think, than it was even, 30 years ago.
Right.
Visual stuff. Like you just expect your bad guys to have something that you can empathize with or understand, not agree. Right. Like I always tell young writers, like our job as nonfiction writers is to explain, not excuse. And it's the same thing with a good villain, right? Like you got to be able to go, shit there, but for the grace of God, go I, like,
right.
And that's super hard.
It's super hard. And anyway, it has been this first novel, I obviously love the story and I love the book, and I early reviews are really positive, so I'm sure people will engage with it. But it has been, as you say, a writer's journey, and it's been awesome.
Are you going to keep it up?
I think so. We'll see. It's hard right now. I'm in the midst of being the chief marketing officer for the book.
Yeah.
Because that's the other problem with being an author is you end up being the chief marketing officer for your work.
Everything. You are the chief everything of it all.
Well, of course. And so I think it'll be January, February. I'll take a pause and sort of say, okay, is there more for Major Tamika Smith to say?
But I mean, are you going to keep writing, even if you don't follow her along?
Oh, I think so. But again, if I was going to write another novel, it'll be about her.
It'll be this.
It'll be about this. And in part because I do, in the back of my head know there's more to say.
Yeah.
And she has more of a story. In part because I think the likelihood of me creating a character who is as strong and human and intellectually honest from a writing perspective as Tamika Smith, I think that would be hard. And I think I'd end up writing Tamika Smith again with a different name.
Listen, I've been doing this for a long time, and just listening to what you've said, I feel like you're going to be writing another book.
Yeah, I hope so. And it's really fun. As you say, that you have to be a little narcissistic about it because it can be painful and it's hard. But I have found a second point of joy beyond my professional life and my family life. So it's a third point of joy, and it's writing, and it's really fun.
And there's something, we'll just end with this. Like there's something I think innately human about telling stories. Like it is what we spend our whole lives doing, right? You go to the doctor, you tell your medical story, like everywhere you go, there is some story. So when you get that world in your head, it's less to me about, I always tell people, even when I was at Wired, I wasn't writing, I was transcribing the story that I saw in my head. Like I was getting that story out, even when it was nonfiction stuff. Like there's just something about that I feel has to come out.
No, you're absolutely right. I did a launch event on Zoom the other night, and we got to talk about this, and I was like, look, storytelling is how you get people to remember things. Even in my business life,
Yeah.
my job was to tell a story that people who work for me could say, oh, I get it, and live that way. So one way or another, I'll be storytelling. It's just a question of whether I'm writing it, speaking it, or living it. Who knows?
That's great. Well, listen, I'm really happy that we had this chance to talk. The book is out now. Yeah, everywhere.
Well, so here's the deal. The book is out. The book is done. It's sitting at the printer waiting for the supply chain to deliver paper.
We're doing the worldwide catastrophe.
It's, and unfortunately, my evil villain Ford Wilkes had nothing to do with this paper supply problem.
Yeah.
I should have written about that in the book. So literally, the book was supposed to launch yesterday. The book has been at the printer for forever. The Kindle version is ready to go, and we're waiting for paper supply.
But pre-orders are up.
Oh yeah, people can order it anywhere.
Yeah, because I think we've all sort of realized like the next 6 months with buying anything is going to be buy and wait.
Be prepared. What I told people on the launch event is, my original idea was launch the book now and then be able to go back to people and say buy for the holiday. My message to you now is buy for the holiday now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's everybody's message. Like literally, I'm going around like I need to get all of my stuff bought now, or else they're going to get it in April.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's absolutely people can pre-order it. It's available. The website is wilkesinsurrection.com. There's a bunch of material there, backgrounds on the characters. There's playlists for each of the characters.
You built a whole world. You built a whole world.
It's a metaverse thing for gaming, right? There's this little mini metaverse there around the Wilkes Insurrection.
But that's why I feel like it's so interesting that people that come to writing from more cinematic places, because that world exists as
absolutely.
I mean, the story you've told, yeah, maybe you didn't know that world as you did it, but like in your head, that world was existing and you were just finding it along the way. And then
so last thing, Brett. So the best piece of marketing material we've done for the Wilkes Insurrection is a 2-minute and 20-second video trailer.
Yeah. Oh yeah, of course.
And you watch that and you go, oh. And so this idea of video, music, writing, and gaming kind of mixing together, super powerful.
And I mean, that's your gig, man.
Thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. This is great. And I can't wait to pick up the book. Thrillers have become weirdly one of my favorite genres in the pandemic. Like they are a great escapism.
Well, let me know when you post and we'll follow up from there.
100%. All right. Have a great day.
Thanks. Cheers.
Well, there you have it. That was my interview with Robbie Bach. The Wilkes Insurrection is out right now. You got a little taste of what my life was like 22 years ago. I don't know if you give a shit about that, but now that is in your head. He's great. I love people that love to talk, obviously. And so it was fun to have him on the show. While we're at it here, couple reminders. If you like what you heard today on the program, I ask you to do 2 things at the top of the show. First, tell your friends about us. The people that are looking for a new podcast, people that are into books, like send them over here. Let them find us. I think they'll be interested. And leave us a review either through Apple Podcasts or over at the Facebook page at the Writers Jam. Don't forget to check out all the other programs on the Solid Listen Podcast Network, including the flagship Mother May I Sleep With podcast with host and our Solid Listen podcast queen, Molly McLear. She and Nicole are building this network up. And I couldn't be happier and prouder to be part of this group. We got these videos coming out every Monday and Friday on the Solid Listen Network YouTube channel. You can also catch them at the Writers Jam, or you can catch the audio version wherever you listen to the Downtown Writers Jam. The Jam comes out every Wednesday. The only way to make sure you don't miss what we're doing, get your ass subscribed wherever you listen to podcasts. And remember, you can always catch us on Twitter and Instagram at the Writers Jam. Until the next time, I will see you around the internet. Don't forget to believe.